Picking up from our discussion on political philosophy, let's now turn our attention to how the intellectual landscape shifted after the medieval period. Often the story told is one of a neat ending, the grand scholastic synthesis crumbling, or scholasticism itself being sidelined. But that's a bit too simple, isn't it? If we don't see scholasticism and medieval philosophy as identical twins, and if we don't hold synthesis up as the only possible philosophical goal, the picture gets much more interesting. We're going to explore how medieval thought didn't just vanish, but actually lingered, influenced later thinkers, and eventually sparked a resurgence. Think of it as an intellectual ghost story. Where did the medieval spirit go, and how did it come back? Right off the bat, we see this fascinating tug of war with Aristotle. Chaucer's Pilgrim, remember? He'd rather have Aristotle than fancy clothes. That shows respect, right? But then fast forward to Francis Bacon in 1597. He calls these scholastics semini sectors hair splitters. Now that's a bit harsh, like calling someone overly meticulous. He acknowledges their value in making distinctions, but maybe not much else. And Molière, the playwright, famously mocks the idea that opium puts people to sleep because it has a dormitive virtue. It's funny, but it captures a real skepticism about whether these traditional explanations were truly explanatory. So right away, we've got three big questions bubbling up. What's Aristotle's role now? Are these endless distinctions useful or just splitting hairs? And how does this old philosophy cope when faced with new scientific ideas? Aquinas was brilliant because he managed to make Aristotle fit within Christian thought. But the Renaissance brought a shift. Suddenly, Greek and Roman texts were everywhere, studied in their original languages, not just through Latin translations. People started seeing how different ancient thought was from medieval Europe. The urgency of blending everything into one Christian system faded. You needed to understand Aristotle on his own terms first. Enter Cajetan, a heavyweight Dominican cardinal, advisor to popes and emperors. He wrote commentaries, debated Luther. But here's the kicker. At the Fifth Lateran Council, he voted against a motion demanding philosophers prove the soul's immortality using reason. Why? Because his reading of Aristotle suggested something else. Something that didn't quite fit the neat synthesis everyone expected. This vote wasn't just a personal quirk, it signaled a deeper change in how Aristotle was being read and understood. So, what convinced Cajetan? It comes down to Aristotle's De Anima, specifically Book I. Aristotle notes some activities are tied to the body, anger for instance. Then he says understanding seems most like something proper to the soul. But wait, he adds a crucial caveat. If understanding relies on phantasia, sensory images, then understanding itself can't exist without the body. For Cajetan, phantasia means sensory stuff. He took this to mean Aristotle saw thought as fundamentally dependent on the senses, making it impossible to be truly separate from the body. It's like Aristotle's own analogy. A straight line touches a sphere at one point, but only if the line is embodied. The distinction between the abstract idea of a line and its physical representation isn't enough to prove the line could exist without any embodiment. Cajetan saw this as Aristotle's formal separation, not real separability. Cajetan's logic flows like this. If understanding isn't properly separate from the body, the soul isn't separable. But Aristotle talks about two parts of the intellect, the potential intellect, which does the thinking, and the active intellect, which somehow makes sense data intelligible. Cajetan argued Aristotle meant only the active intellect had true independence. It's the active intellect that does the heavy lifting, transforming raw sense data. The potential intellect, the part we use for thought, is still mixed up with sensory stuff. Only the active intellect, he claimed, could be truly separate in essence and thus immortal. The potential intellect? Just formally separate, like geometry, and ultimately corruptible. This even tied into Aristotle's ethics, where happiness is limited because our intellect depends on the light of the active intellect. See how one text interpretation cascades into a whole different view of immortality. Now, Cajetan tried to play it cool, saying, "Hey, I'm just reporting Aristotle, folks, I'm not endorsing his views on immortality." He even said he'd try to show Aristotle was wrong using philosophy. But his opponents, fellow Dominicans Spina and Catharinus, weren't buying it. They freaked out. They saw him messing with Aristotle, the bedrock of their tradition, causing confusion. They were annoyed he was trying to argue Aristotle philosophically, especially when he threw in a Neoplatonic-sounding argument about cosmic harmony needing a soul-like entity. It was like saying, "We've already got Aquinas sorting this out, don't go digging up old texts and challenging us." Cajetan's dissent highlighted the clash. sticking to the established synthesis versus exploring Aristotle's original, sometimes uncomfortable, ideas. Aristotle was still powerful, but some found his direction unwelcome. Okay, let's switch gears to another hot topic, the effect of distinctions. How did medieval thinkers handle concepts? Aquinas had a neat theory. Our senses give us individual images, phantasms. The active intellect then lifts these up, generalizes them, creating a concept in the potential intellect. Think about it. You see a cat door, you see a book page. Both look rectangular. How do you grasp that shared shape? Aquinas says the active intellect does this conceptualizing, moving from the particular phantasm to the universal concept. It's a way to explain how we get beyond just seeing things to understanding categories. This whole process hinges on these distinctions, particularly between the intellect's operations. Let's see later thinkers wrestled with this. Cajetan again weighs in, this time commenting on Aquinas' Summa. He tackles a standard objection. How can the spiritual active intellect work with the material phantasm? Can the higher act upon the lower? Cajetan's reply is clever. The phantasm doesn't suddenly contain the concept, it stays material. Instead, the active intellect uses the phantasm as an instrument. It enables the potential intellect to produce the concept. He uses the light analogy again. Light works by illuminating a medium like air, and then objects in that medium become visible. Similarly, the active intellect illuminates the phantasm objectively, making its essential nature apparent, stripping away the specific details. The concept formed in the potential intellect is the formal effect, abstract and spiritual. The phantasm itself is only abstract insofar as it's illuminated. It's a subtle distinction focusing on the effect rather than the mechanism. Then comes Francisco Suarez a century later, tackling the same issue in his De Anima. He agrees both phantasm and active intellect are needed, but he asks, how can the spiritual intellect affect the material phantasm? He finds Cajetan's instrument analogy weak. How can a lower-order thing really act as an instrument for a higher one? Just because they're both in the same soul doesn't make it work. Suarez proposes a different model. The phantasm provides the material for the active intellect. It's not that the concept is drawn from the phantasm. Rather, the phantasm offers the active intellect something to work with, like a sample. Because of their connection in the soul, they operate in harmony. The intellect acts, and the phantasm imagines accordingly. It's less about direct action and more about providing the raw material for the intellect's operation. Now here's the critical point Fitzpatrick makes. Cajetan and Suarez, by treating the light analogy so literally, are missing the point. Aquinas used the light analogy metaphorically. He wasn't saying the intellect works exactly like light bouncing off things. He distinguished between the original meaning of light, making things visible, and its extended use, making things known. Just as light is necessary for vision, the active intellect is necessary for understanding. The analogy shows a difference, not a mechanism. But Cajetan and Suarez took the analogy too far, dissecting it like a machine. What they have in common, despite disagreeing, is that they pushed the boundaries between the material, senses, phantasms, and the spiritual intellect further apart than Aquinas did. They were subtly paving the way for a world where thought and extension would seem more separate, setting the stage perfectly for the 17th century's scientific revolution. The 17th century, what a time for innovation. Gilbert with magnets, Kepler mapping planets, Galileo gazing at the moons of Jupiter, Boyle messing with gases. Science was exploding. Philosophy felt the same pressure. Thinkers like Bacon explicitly broke from tradition. Hobbes mocked scholastic language, and Descartes seemed to start everything anew. Amidst all this dazzling novelty, what could the old medieval baggage offer? Some defenders tried to hold the line, while others, trained in the scholastic way, found the new ideas problematic or saw flaws in the old system. This clash forced a re-evaluation of those very medieval distinctions we've been discussing. How did they hold up under the strain of new discoveries and new ways of thinking? One major attack was that the tradition was just vague. Remember Molière's normative virtue? That became shorthand for accusations like Legrand's. What good is a scholastic form when explaining why the moon waxes and wanes? Parties fought back, asking if Cartesian explanations like a certain shape for plant growth were any clearer than the scholastics' intussusception, piercing inwards. He argued traditional philosophy aimed to open the mind and connect to theology, unlike Cartesianism, which he saw as superficial, like explaining a key's function by its opening virtue instead of its mechanics, turning philosophy into a locksmith's manual. Another charge, also from parties, was that Descartes' matter was too simple, couldn't account for the world's variety. This naturally led to the big question: what about the matter-form distinction for non-living things? The traditional view often worked best for living things. A dog stays a dog even though its cells change. But what about a lump of lead melting into liquid metal? Or wood burning into ash? Defenders like Gudin tried to extend the idea. Perfect mixtures, he argued, had real substantial forms beyond just mixing ingredients. Burning wasn't just rearranging atoms. It was a substantial change, fire becoming smoke, losing one form and gaining another. Minerals had weird properties, magnets attracting iron, mercury mixing with gold strangely, jade easing pain, suggesting hidden forms. Yet even Gudin hedged his bets, adding at least for animals. Lagrange was more skeptical, struggling to find convincing proofs for inanimate forms, preferring examples from the human soul. He saw burning as a clear case, but bending a stick. No need for a new entity there. The old framework was clearly struggling to explain the new physics and chemistry emerging around them. Let's take the wine to vinegar example. Wine becomes vinegar. It's a different substance. That's a substantial change. But the scholastics sometimes applied the same language used for accidental changes, like water getting hotter to this. Critics pointed out the problems. First, the idea of a single indeterminate materia prima underlying all changes, like wine, vinegar, wood, ash, seemed like wishful thinking. Who proved this stuff existed? Duhamel called it vague. Second, treating forms as real caused headaches. Aristotle warned against it, leading to infinite regress. Where do forms come from? Where do they go? How can matter keep producing endless forms without running dry? What even is potentiality in matter? These weren't just quibbles. They struck at the heart of the scholastic system's intelligibility. Leibniz offers a fascinating perspective. He praised the scholastics for grasping the unity and character of things, something he felt Descartes missed. He even tried to bridge the gap between Aristotle and the new science. But he also criticized them harshly. He accused some of clinging to forms like little gods, diunculi. Look at the example of the corpse instantly acquiring a cadaveric form. Gudin presented this as a quick philosophical trick, but Leibniz saw it as a confusion, mistaking philosophical distinctions for physical mechanisms. It's the same mistake Fitzpatrick identified earlier with Cajetan and Suarez dissecting the light analogy. Why the temptation? Perhaps because the new science was so successful at explaining things with size, shape, and motion. The scholastics, feeling the heat, might have been tempted to treat their own abstract distinctions like forms or intellect as if they were also just another kind of mechanism. This debate wasn't just philosophical, it had theological teeth. When Legrand dismissed forms as idle, he represented the Cartesian stance. Carleton pushed back, arguing the variety and constancy of things, demanded a principle of unity, pointing to accidental forms needed for the doctrine of transubstantiation in the Eucharist. Theology became a key battleground. Interestingly, defenders of the old ways seemed largely blind to the biggest novelty in Descartes: his methodic doubt, his separation of mind and body, his grounding in God and self. Maybe they saw Descartes as closer to Augustine, whose influence was booming then, offering a foundation in God and soul. Augustine, predating the scholastic debates, offered a neutral ground both sides could appeal to. But the core Cartesian starting point remained largely unaddressed in the defense of the medieval tradition. So did medieval philosophy just die out? Not entirely. Even when rejected, it left echoes. Think about it. Cartesian ideas about the Eucharist, despite the philosophical objections, were taught in Catholic seminaries well into the 19th century. At Oxford, the Bachelor of Arts degree involved a license to lecture on Aristotle's logic, apparently granted quite vacuously. And at Ushaw College, an extra morning nap was called an Aristotle. Okay, maybe that's more folklore than serious philosophy, but it shows the lingering cultural presence. The point is, medieval thought didn't just disappear, it persisted, albeit sometimes in caricatured or contested forms, long after the supposed triumph of the new era. Fast forward to today. If you read widely in modern philosophy, you'll bump into medieval thinkers constantly. Descartes shares a starting point with Augustine. Spinoza and Leibniz grapple with issues echoing medieval concerns. Even those who rejected scholasticism often stood on its shoulders, consciously or unconsciously. Thinkers compared Locke to Abelard, Hume to Occam. Yet for centuries, these connections were often ignored or denied. The current buzz around medieval philosophy is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. So, how did we get here? What sparked this revival? Several things converged. Culturally, there was a Gothic revival, a renewed interest in medieval history, fueled by figures like Victor Cousin and Horo. Philosophically, modern thought had run many of its tracks into the ground, creating a hunger for alternatives, and medieval thinkers offered rich possibilities. Crucially, the massive publication of Minya's Patrologia Graeca and Latina put thousands of primary sources accessible for the first time. Then in 1878, Pope Leo XIII dropped the bombshell encyclical Aeterni Patris, hailing Aquinas as the undisputed master of scholasticism. This papal endorsement ignited a firestorm of scholarly activity. The Leonine Commission started publishing Aquinas' works, and institutes popped up in Rome and Louvain. The Louvain Institute, in particular, was pivotal. It brought rigorous scholarship, became self-aware about its methods, and ambitiously tried to engage medieval thought with contemporary issues, aiming to show its ongoing relevance. Key figures emerged. Maurice de Wolf started mapping the whole field, initially trying to find a unified scholastic core, but later revealing the vast diversity. In Paris, Jacques Maritain and Etienne Gilson became giants. Maritain championed Thomism as a vital alternative voice. Gilson, ironically arriving via studying Descartes, found the scholastic roots of Cartesianism, ended up loving Aquinas more than Descartes, and then embarked on a monumental exploration of the entire medieval spectrum, from Augustine to Occam, developing a nuanced historical approach. War sent them to North America, where Gilson founded the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies in Toronto, a powerhouse that spread this revival across the continent. Add to this Boehner's work on Occam, Moody's on logic, Wolfson's groundbreaking studies on Jewish and Islamic philosophy, and Kretzmann's editorial leadership and teaching, and you see how the field blossomed, producing scholars who engaged deeply with medieval thought using modern tools, without necessarily becoming neo-Thomists themselves. This revival fostered integration. Scholars started bringing together Christian, Jewish, and Islamic traditions, speculative and analytic approaches, early and late medieval thinkers. Conferences and societies dedicated to medieval philosophy flourished. More importantly, medieval thought began breaking into the mainstream. Take ethics. Elizabeth Anscombe and Peter Geach introduced Anglo-American audiences to the power of Aristotelian Thomistic moral philosophy. In logic, Bochensky and the Kniels busted the myth that nothing interesting happened between the Stoics and the moderns. As their work and specialized studies like Moody's circulated, along with better editions and translations, logicians like Arthur Prior and Peter Geach took notice. Medieval philosophy wasn't just a historical curiosity anymore, it was relevant to current debates. Now, looking at the current scene, especially in continental philosophy and related movements like radical orthodoxy, we see different flavors of engagement. There's a significant historical thread connecting phenomenology and hermeneutics back to medieval thought. More recently, thinkers have drawn striking analogies, like comparing Aquinas to Heidegger or Augustine to Derrida. The radical orthodoxy group, driven by theological concerns, has also delved into pre-modern thought. What's notable here is their focus. Unlike analytical philosophy, which often dives deep into logic and metaphysics, these groups tend to focus less on those technicalities. Also, they frequently look at the earlier or later medieval periods, rather than the central figures like Aquinas, Scotus, and Occam. Why? Perhaps because there's a perceived parallel. The technicality of analytical philosophy mirrors scholasticism, while the interpretive, literary turn of hermeneutics resonates with thinkers like Augustine or Eckhart. And maybe, just maybe, the dissatisfaction with overly technical analysis today echoes the Renaissance complaints about scholastic sophistry. Beyond these broader trends, Haldane identifies three main ways people engage with medieval philosophy today, often blending them. First, the historical approach, just trying to understand the thinkers and their times, like studying any other historical period. This requires solid textual work, reliable editions, translations. Second, the comparative approach, looking for parallels between medieval ideas and contemporary theories in logic, language, science, hoping to shed light on both. This needs a good grasp of the historical context which the historians provide. Third, the practicing approach, actually doing philosophy, inspired by or continuing the traditions of the scholastics, perhaps using modern analytical tools. Thinkers like Marilyn McCord Adams, Eleanor Stump, and Norman Kretzmann himself, or Alistair MacIntyre drawing on Aquinas for ethics, or John Finnis applying it to law and morality, fall into this category. The result? A richer appreciation of the medieval thinker's complexity, fruitful cross-disciplinary research, and a vibrant field of philosophical theology. What's striking about the current scene is how much difference often falls along the lines of analytical versus radical hermeneutical approaches, rather than the historical comparative practicing categories. This leads to a tantalizing thought. Are we due for a new synthesis similar to the one achieved by the medievals themselves? Perhaps the key lies in understanding how they uniquely blended the scientific inquiry into the natural world with sapiential reflection on ultimate questions. Whether we reach such a synthesis or not, one thing is certain: medieval philosophy is no longer just a dusty footnote. It's firmly established as a vital part of the history of philosophy, standing shoulder to shoulder with ancient Greece and Rome. That alone is a huge step forward. And that brings us to the end of this exploration of how medieval philosophy continued to resonate and eventually found its place in the broader narrative of intellectual history. Thank you.